why do we want to talk about commercial tree planting and why now? Just 2 or so weeks ago, the Scottish Government met with the Climate Change Committee to have identified that tree planting and peatland restoration are key actions for Scotland to tackle the twin climate and biodiversity crises. This must be done thoughtfully, but the tree plantations that are being planted across hundreds of hectares today have very little in common with a native Scottish woodland or forest, and this is an issue for nature and people. As many of you will know, a healthy woodland or forest that has a good balance of disturbance will have trees of different ages in various densities over time, which allows other plants to grow underneath or on the trees and provides a rich habitat for animals, insects, fungi, and microorganisms. In contrast, commercial plantations can often have very dense rows of trees planted at the same time, which creates a blanket of fairly uniform trees that draw up masses of water and block out light, leaving very little for anything else to live on. Commercial planting also currently favors a specific tree species, the Sitka spruce, which is a fast-growing conifer that is not native to Scotland and spreading aggressively beyond where it's planted. So already with these 2 examples, we're starting to see the picture that commercial tree plantations are able to significantly alter the environment. Now, the issues that we're talking about today are not new and have been known for a very long time, although they've had some recent attention with reports coming out, including the Royal Society of Edinburgh's inquiry into public financial support for tree planting and forestry, and Scottish Environment Link's reports on invasive non-native species in Scotland, which includes Sitka spruce. At the same time, communities who are having their home landscapes planted in this way are seeing the environmental impacts, and they're struggling to have their voices heard. So today we'll focus on how the issues with commercial forestry regulation are being experienced on the ground. Through the cases that we've received to our free legal advice service on environmental law in Scotland, ERCS has identified some systemic issues with the regulation of tree plantations that our rights officer Cornell will talk through first. He'll also give some context into how commercial tree planting is regulated and enforced in Scotland. We'll then hear from 2 campaigners who have generously joined us today to share their time and knowledge and experiences. Audrey Baird from campaign group Help Trees Help Us will speak about invasive conifers and how they're affecting Scotland's remaining ancient woodlands, as well as give other examples with commercial forestry practices, issues with commercial forestry practices. Then we'll have Morag Paterson, who is a freelance consultant and member of Communities for Diverse Forestry and Forest Policy Group. And she will speak about how communities are being consulted on when a new tree plantation is set up in their home area and what needs to be improved in this process. We'll send any resources that are mentioned during this webinar in the email that you'll receive after the event, and you'll also find some links in the chat. At the end, we'll have time for a Q&A, and please send your questions to me in the chat throughout the event. We won't be taking questions directly from attendees due to timekeeping, but I'll collate them and ask them from our panel. But first, we'll hear from Cornell. Over to you.
Thank you. There we go. Everyone's seeing the right screen? Great. So hello and thank you for coming and attending this webinar. My name is Cornell Hanxomphou and I am the Rights Officer at ERCS. And I'm going to give some background into commercial plantations and then highlight some of the issues that ERCS have found both through our advice work and through my work as a rights officer engaging with individuals and communities. So the 2, as you already mentioned, the 2 key policies to offset Scotland's greenhouse gas emissions are peatland restoration and tree planting. The Forestry grant scheme seeks to rapidly expand new woodland planting through public funding. It also includes a full tax relief on profits and capital gains tax to help managers create new woodlands within Scotland. This aims to bring much needed private investment to meet the ambitious tree planting targets within Scotland. I don't reference the number that they have for the targets here because it has changed recently and it may change again because it's subject to funding availability. Most current grant investments are commercial plantations, predominantly invasive non-native conifer species like Sitka spruce, which is often densely planted together. Now, this is good for producing timber quickly and it's good for generating income quickly, but is it really beneficial to nature, climate, and communities like it is intended to? A review found between 2014 and 2021 that £274 million grants were approved and only £42 million didn't go to plant commercial plantations. So just a quick disclaimer that some of the current private investors of this fund are multi-billion-dollar finance companies who own billions worth of shares in fossil fuel companies. So this has implications for greenwashing regarding the validity of carbon credits and has consequences for the inflation of Scotland's land prices, fueling land acquisition away from communities to corporations. So with so many new commercial plantations appearing around Scotland, there are growing concerns with the rapidly increasing rate of these developments and how they affect the environments they are in. Some of these concerns have been encountered through ERCS's advice service and again through my work. So under forestry regulations, forestry proposals must undergo an environmental impact assessment or an EIA in cases where significant environmental impact may arise. Scottish Forestry is the public body that's responsible for this, and they determine whether an EIA is required for a new plantation. The decision as to whether a proposal needs an EIA or not is stated within what's called a screening opinion. So ERCS has been contacted several times by individuals and communities concerned that Scottish Forestry has not required an EIA for proposed plantation developments, even if they may be on nature designations and may affect local water supplies. So ERCS put in a Freedom of Information request to see how many EIAs were required since Scottish Forestry was established in 2019. Of the 305 applications for new plantations that were on nature conservation designations, which covered tens of thousands of hectares, only one EIA was required. Many of these proposals were above 400 hectares, and all were on designations such as special sites of scientific interest, national nature reserves, special protected areas, deep peat soils, which I'll go into more further on, and more. So why didn't these proposals need an EIA? The answer to that is within the screening opinions that Scottish Forestry give to each of these planning developments. However, ERCS found that these screening opinions are not publicly available on Scottish Forestry's website or by any other means electronically, which means they are actually in breach of their statutory duty to make these available under the forestry regulations. ERCS made a formal complaint to Scottish Forestry, which was not upheld. ERCS has now escalated this by sending in a representation to Environmental Standards Scotland, ESS, which is the environmental watchdog post-Brexit in Scotland. This representation is currently under evaluation. This information does really need to be accessible and transparent to the communities and NGOs so they can all be part of the decision-making process. Both Audrey and Morag will speak more on this. So I spoke about compliance in terms of planning and what that means around EIAs, but how do commercial plantations fare in terms of compliance once they're already up? So one example of this is in Argyll, where SEPA carried out planned and unplanned compliance inspections over 2022 and 23 for controlled activities that can affect the water environment. Out of the 47 felled areas inspected, disappointingly, only 53% were compliant with their licenses. This was lower than the inspections that were done in 2014 and 15, which saw 74% compliance. And after a number of improvement measures were carried out, that rose to 90% in 2019. So we've gone back down from that. Examples of this poor compliance include localized site flooding, bank scouring, barriers to fish migration, conifer planting and ground preparation less than 1 meter from water channels, and pollution runoff into nearby triple SIs. So a reminder that these are only water environment associated compliances that were expected for. These are not to do with anything else besides water. So there's very limited information of how much compliance is, and we don't know what is actually occurring. So the last issue I wanted to raise is not particularly with failed regulation, but more a potentially misconsideration of the environmental impact of these plantations, particularly for commercial tree planting schemes that are intended to be carbon sequestration. So as I mentioned before, many of these commercial plantation schemes were proposed and approved on deep peat soil without an EIA. Conifers established on peaty soils can drain and disturb them, releasing the carbon that would have been permanently stored within them. Species like Sitka spruce are so good at self-seeding, and they're spreading so fast that they threaten a large area of peatland within Scotland. Additionally, to prepare these soils for planting, ditches will be excavated to drain water away from the plantations, furthering that release of carbon. Then that carbon-rich water can then impact nearby river ecosystems. These plantations, which are intended to reduce Scotland's carbon emissions by sequestration, can release more carbon than they actually store. This makes the government's two key policies for offsetting carbon emissions at odds with each other. So, in conclusion, increasing tree planting to fight climate breakdown, increase biodiversity, and benefit communities is a great idea, and it is achievable. But there are major concerns as to whether the methodology is being designed and regulated enough to ensure that they are actually beneficial and not detrimental to both nature, climate, and communities. That's all from me.
Thank you, Cornell, for sharing that information. We'll now go to Audrey, and just to say that Audrey, there's a bit of a windy weather where Audrey is, so the internet connection might be a bit shaky, but you do turn your video off, Audrey, if it looks like you need to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia and Cornell, and thank you so much, ERCS, for creating spaces for communities and campaigners to have a voice. My talk's going to be about giving a sense of the degradation and nature loss in and around our community, and my lived experience of being encircled and increasingly threatened by native woodland destruction and invasive non-native conifer plantations, and all the associated infrastructure that goes with that, and never forgetting, of course, the wildlife that's been killed and displaced by these. So I've only got 10 or 15 minutes or so, and can only skim the surface of the magnitude of what's being risked and erased here. I'm sure I will annoy some people today by generalising and not referencing information, but everything I want to talk about is in the extensive published documentation supporting our Scottish Parliament Petition 1812 for native and ancient woodland, which has been under consideration by the Parliamentary Critique Committee for 4 years. Also, my co-petitioner Fiona Baker is here today and contributing on the chat. The 4 fundamental points I really want to make today are about our local experiences are that 1, our community is 100% powerless to protect local nature. 2, our direct experience is that laws to protect nature are pie in the sky, out of reach, out of date, unintelligible, and unenforced, except for those with big money and contacts, of course. 3, there is no landscape scale oversight of the combined impacts on nature and communities of multiple local acts of degradation by many perpetrators. And on that point, our hearts are with the Stobo Residents Action Group in the Borders, now petitioning for a judicial review at the Court of Sessions into a vast commercial plantation approved for their area. And 4thly, invasive non-native species, including commercial conifers, are the biggest destroyers of terrestrial nature in Scotland. That is according to the 2024 State of Nature report. And we certainly see that here in Argyll. So I've been sort of easing you into this presentation with a lovely photograph. This is the best neighbour anyone who cares about Scotland could wish for. I've lived next to this little ancient bluebell wood for 15 years. Its historic gorge and waterfall inspired a scene in one of Sir Walter Scott's novels, and all the trees here are my good friends. I thank the bluebells each year for putting on best show in town, and I've told all the birds, hedgehogs, otters, foxes, bats, and other wildlife how beautiful they are and how much I love them. I'm not the only person in the community who adores this wood and wildlife. A group of us have worked with the community justice team to literally remove tons of fly tipping and rubbish dumped in the wood over decades. Sorry, it's very windy where I live at the moment, and that can sometimes interfere. Oh, there we go. Right, it's moved.
Perfect.
Okay, was that you or was that me that did that?
That was you.
That was me. Great. Okay, right. So commercial tree plantations are erasing the colours, contours, and historic natural identity of the hills around me and across Scotland. The vast majority of plantations in Scotland are dominated by one conifer species, as Cornell said, from the United States, that's Sitka spruce. And as you'd expect coming from the United States, it's a superpower tree that in its native landscape grows fast and big in far more hostile environments than anything it encounters here in Scotland. The logging industry loves Sitka and Sitka loves Scotland because none of our native trees or plants present any obstacles to its advance. So at the start of the COVID lockdowns in 2020, bored kids and their affluent parents decided to build a mountain bike trail through the wood you saw in the first photograph. They built it in May, during the nesting season, and just as the bluebells were coming into flower. It was intolerable. Situations like this truly test the meaning of love, self-respect, peace of mind, and mental health. So we got up and fought for the wood, from sit-ins on the bike track through publicity to the Scottish Parliament petition I mentioned earlier. 4 years later, we're a great deal more clued up on why Scotland only has around 4% of degraded ancient and native woodland left. I'm going to whip through these next few slides that are just intended to give you a sense of the spectrum of assaults on our local nature. So a local landowner clear-felled in their planted ancient woodland without a licence from Scottish Forestry. Scottish Forestry officials attended and said the landowner could be prosecuted and even get a £500,000 fine. We didn't know it at the time, but this was all hot air. Scottish government regulator Scottish Forestry hasn't taken forward a single prosecution for unlicensed felling in ancient woodland for at least 10 years, if ever. They blame Scotland's Procurator Fiscal for not being interested in ancient woodland. And then we had our council selling a mature public mixed wood. The community fought to secure over 100 tree preservation orders. The developer cleared the wood and the trees with tree preservation orders. Tree preservation orders, which are managed by local authorities, are very dangerous indeed. They lull us into a stupor of somehow thinking that nature is protected. Then we had an abandoned 76-acre farm, which was taken over by squatters in 2019, and they set fire to it a dozen times. All of these incidents have very long and involved backstories, including official complaints, community consultations, police involvement, and so on. But the point I'm making here is that nobody has faced any notable consequences for any of these acts of destruction, and there is no official deterrent to destroying nature, which leaves communities like ours resorting to acts of desperation. To top it all off, international investment companies who bought our hill are replacing it with an artificial invasive non-native species landscape. All of this 3D printing over Scotland is funded and facilitated by our government and public bodies with woodland creation grants and tax breaks, permitted development planning, and as Cornell spoke excellently on, risk-based, relaxed environmental impact assessment rights, and also a ministerial exemption for conifers to be invasive due to their economic value. Plus, plantation management companies have mostly ignored the UK forestry standard around managing the invasive spread of their polluting conifers. In the photo, you can see the new 500-acre commercial plantation is being bolted onto an existing, mature, vast, disease-riven monoculture plantation up in the top right there. And also look out, and we also look out across the loch at conifer plantations and disappearing fragments of native woodland. So this is a very typical view in Argyll. A thin strip of native woodland survives near the bottom of the hill, but its days are numbered because housing development and invasive species like rhododendron, laurel and bamboo will be spreading up from the gardens, and the Sitka, that's dominating the hill, of course, will be self-seeding down. Not very long ago, 80% of Scotland was covered in native broadleaf trees and 3 native conifers. We only have 3 native conifers in Scotland: Scots pine, juniper and yew. Our societies were built on those trees, but by the 20th century, tree cover was as low as 4%. Early 20th century tree cover was as low as 4%, and now we only have a fragmented 1 to 2% of Scotland's age and woodland left. Compare that with commercial plantation expansion, which has rocketed from 0% to 16%, or 1/6 of our country, in the blink of an eye. The scale and pace of this land use change is mind-blowing, and the impacts on soil, water quality, biodiversity and communities are only now being understood by those of us outside the logging industry. However, I must stress that Scotland's logging and associated timber products industries are very valuable to the Scottish economy and support lots and lots of jobs. It's also an expensive and long-term investment. And the UK stamps the 3rd largest deforestation footprint on Earth after China and US, importing just over 80% of its timber from abroad. Not surprisingly, Scotland actually already grows, by volume at least, enough timber for its population and still export wood. But the logging industry in Scotland is all about soft-growing woods, fast-growing, soft-growing woods. And the industry grumbles about having to grow hardwoods. So we still have to import those precious and slow-growing woods. While the world's remaining old-growth forests continue to be ruthlessly exploited and usually replaced with agriculture and tree monocultures, the booming human population and higher levels of consumption are forecast to see demand for wood rise by 3 to 4% every year. So these are just some of the reasons that the logging industry gives our governments to persuade them to ramp up tree planting targets and also continue with public handouts. So this is a photograph, which is just the tip of the toxic payload, basically, that's being delivered to our hill just now. It says on those bags, dangerous to fish and insects, especially bees, and also eye irritant. So while we're trying to plant for pollinators in our gardens, meters up the hill, the government is funding the logging industry to kill them. This is my battered old copy of the Forestry Commission's guidance on their invasive non-native species commercial trees. If you want another useful perspective on why Scotland has a biodiversity crisis, read this document. In 2022, the then Minister Mary McCallan and our MSP Jackie Bailey set up a very useful meeting with Scottish forestry officials and us. I can't do that meeting any justice here, but the officials were very courageous to tell us about the pressure huge government tree planting targets were having on staff, how much time they have to waste trying to persuade afforestation companies and landowners to make even minor environmental improvements to their tree planting plans, and crucially, that invasive non-native commercial conifers that have self-seeded out of plantations are pollution and a menace, and that's quote unquote. In these photos, Sitka has self-seeded and is growing directly out of the veteran native trees. One of the most useful developments from the petition has been that politicians have visited ancient woods to see how they're affected by commercial conifers for themselves. And once you see it, you start to see it everywhere. Rhododendron ponticum and commercial conifers in a plantation in Kill. It's a super powered love match made in hell. Please remember this photograph: Sitka spruce and rhododendron ponticum natural regeneration thriving on a rock face carved out to make a road at Glen Douglas. I don't think there's anything else living in there. So what chance does Scotland's nature have? So the logging industry lauds the latest iteration of the UK forestry standard for reducing the percentage of a single species in a plantation by 10% from a maximum of 75% to 65%. Now that single species is Sitka spruce, and it couldn't care less about the 65% rule. Sitka will self-seed into any unplanted areas like deep peatland or fringes planted with puny little native broadleaf saplings in their broken plastic tubes. And that's what's happening here in these photographs of land on its second or even third rotation of felling and replanting. So this is a native woodland near Loch Lomond, and there's a lovely bench to enjoy the view from if the Sitka hadn't got there first. I'll leave you to read these quotes for yourselves. There's been a lot of work done decades ago to understand the colossal threat conifers pose in countries like Norway and New Zealand. Sitka is the biggest problem in Scotland, and as you can see here, it's been blacklisted in Norway, but lodgepole pine, hybrid larch, western hemlock, western red cedar, Norway spruce, all commercial species, and others are also self-seeding in Scotland, as well as Sitka spruce, and this will be part of our legacy for future generations. So I hope you've had a chance to read these quotes, and they do come from very credible bodies, the University of Bergen and so on. So in complete contrast to Scotland and the other UK countries, the New Zealand government has shelled out and earmarked billions of dollars to get the public engaged in reporting and removing self-seeding conifers. And this is a great series of time-lapse images showing you what self-seeding, or wilding as they call it there, conifers are doing to their country. This is how fast these conifers can spread and take over in less than 20 years. So I started this presentation off with a photo of the kind of diverse, colourful, life-giving woodland, ancient woodland that Scotland actually wants to grow when it has the chance to do so. And this is a picture of what the logging industry prefers. I don't really fancy a woodland wellbeing walk in that wood. So thankfully, I'm finishing up now and looking forward to listening to Morag, and I wanted to leave you with a quick multiple choice question, which is, and I know you can't shout out here, so I will just give you the answer. So according to a 2010 Forestry Commission report about commercial conifers, how many seedlings do you think the author said one single Sitka spruce tree could produce to cover just one single hectare of land? Right, it's greater than 100,000 seedlings in 1 hectare. And if you saw in that previous slide, I think it's from the University of Bergen, they're saying, that the seedlings can disperse over a far wider area than that from a single tree. So as soon as you've got a single Sitka spruce that is self-seeded, it then goes on to produce all of these saplings, and that's how you get that invasive spread. So thank you for listening to me. Thank you for coming to the webinar, and please do check out our petition and sign it if you haven't already done so. Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey. We'll put links in the chat as well as in the follow-up email. We'll now move to Morag, who is going to talk and share her experience with community consultation on new commercial tree plantations. Over to you, Morag.
Thank you, Yulia. Is that sharing happening okay?
That's
Great.
right.
Okay, thanks very much for having me, and thanks, Audrey. That's going to be a really, really hard act to follow. So I'm Morag Paterson. I've been campaigning over the last 4 or 5 years for better community engagement around commercial forestry, which is done primarily on a voluntary basis, and kind of taking a collaborative approach to working with everyone involved. I've had a lot of lived experience as well as a consultee, because I live in one of the areas that have very kind of rapid forest expansion. As Audrey said with her piece, it's impossible to go into depth in 10 minutes today, so you're going to get a very quick whistle-stop tour of why I think community engagement matters with commercial forestry, where I think we currently stand, what the issues are, and some ideas for moving forward. So why is it important? Might be stating the obvious, but we can just rattle through. I think the first thing to say is that it's very important that we stop considering community engagement as a kind of one-stop shop, a quick point in time contact to get an approval or a long-term management plan signed off. We need to be building much longer-term relationships with everyone involved. If we really want to get away from that legacy of the 70s and 80s, because we're in danger of repeating that with a sort of slight nuance this time round if we don't tackle this kind of community engagement issue properly very quickly. There's a whole raft of policies that, kind of relate to this. We've got the Just Transition, the National Strategy for Economic Transformation, if you like a long one. Community wealth building, community wellbeing, community benefits, rural development, reversing depopulation, resilience and adaptation. There's been good research work done on this as well, you know, so we have some of the tools for moving this forward, but we seem for whatever reason to be a little bit slow in progressing that. So we'll talk quickly about good engagement, first of all, and what communities can add when they are properly involved. This isn't an exhaustive list by any means, it's just putting some ideas out there. The sense of place is really important. You know, locals have a very strong sense of place. There's no back of beyond to people who live in rural Scotland. And that is often forgotten in the kind of tick box consultations that we're seeing at the moment. The kind of rich cultural and historical associations with land are ignored. And because with those sort of relationships with land intergenerational often, there comes a sense of kind of custodianship and belonging. And there's just no room for that in the consultation process as it happens at the moment. Locals often know the landscape intimately. That can be about key features, it can be habitats and species, and also where they've been over long periods of time, not just over the sort of few months of a survey, and also have great ideas for where access and amenity could be improved, and a lot of information on waterways and flooding and what goes on there with the sort of change of seasons as well, not the averages that we quite often talk about. I was asked to give an example of some good engagement. We had 2 walks here led by Forestry and Land Scotland when they were consulting on a long-term management plan that I think were exceptionally good. They were done in conjunction with the Community Council, and there was a really good 2-way exchange of information there where the foresters could talk about their objectives and the constraints that they were dealing with, and the community could talk about how they use the woodland and some of the really important features to them. And that would be about trees, species, geological, archaeological features. A really wide breadth of knowledge was exchanged. And then alongside that, same forest consultation was also an artistic consultation event, which took people to a forest block that had been felled for power lines in this case, over the, you know, a couple of years beforehand, and were asked to design a forest for in 100 years' time. And that's the kind of example of how you may be able to get more people involved by using a much wider scope of engagement. A lot of people who wouldn't come to a kind of factual or policy-based or technical consultation may well come to an artist walk or a wildlife walk or a citizen science walk. So it's just sort of throwing that out there as an idea. So with all this good guidance around and research and ideas and recommendations for how things can go well, why are things still going quite so wrong? I think there's widely acknowledged tensions around commercial afforestation, especially where I'm from in the south of Scotland, where there's a lot of it going on, and I know up in Cowell as well, where Audrey's based. These tensions can often be dismissed as coming from vocal locals or in a little isolated pocket of people with a bee in their bonnet, which I think is a huge mistake. At the extreme end of what we're hearing, we've got both foresters and community reps reporting mental health issues. There's a lot of anxiety, a lot of sleepless nights, and you know, nobody wants that. It's ridiculous that we're kind of dealing with that in this day and age. So just sort of to give you a rough idea of what happens in practice if you're a community councillor and a forest application lands with you, you'll probably be given a map, a letter, a drop-in session if you're really lucky, and the process unfolds from there. You won't have been, it's unlikely that you'll have been given any kind of training or signposted to any support or general resources or have any idea whatsoever of how that framework works that this process sits within, whether that's at the sort of presumptive phase of the local development plan, which Scottish Forestry might point you to, or the local authority who will say it's absolutely nothing to do with us. So it's very difficult to know who's responsible for what element and how and when you can be involved, or how and when, where to get help and advice. So it's very dependent on the applicant and the regulator to do that. And even when people are there to answer your questions, the community often doesn't know what questions they can ask, if that makes sense, which makes for a very kind of unfair, uneven playing field. So there's a whole list of things here: community capacity, that's time and resources, lack of guidance. There's a problem about information access and transparency. So there I'm talking about communities have rightly got concerns about biodiversity, soil, water, cumulative impacts, which don't seem to have a very robust assessment at all. I think if we could be sharing the environmental data a lot more as a matter of course, so that would be ecological data, habitat, species, water and soil, and not only sharing that information with communities, but sharing the responses from the competent authority. So we'd like to see what SEPA say in response to a survey, what NatureScot say, what the local authorities say. Whoever's commenting, we would like to see their response, and then we have a much better sense of what oversight there has been, and if we feel like anything's missing, or if we feel like our concerns have actually already been dealt with and we don't need to take up more time dealing with them. There's also a problem with kind of arm's length communication and poor communication. We often, we don't know who the forest managers are often. They're very rare, the owners, sorry, we don't know who the owners are, and they're very rarely in the room with us. So we're having conversations with people and the person holding the power isn't in the room. And there can quite often be a big long triangulation between kind of like, what's more than triangulation, agents, factors, trustees, forming this great big long chain that takes, one email, one piece of dialogue or question can take 4 months to answer. And if you throw in a lot of staff turnover into that as well, then it's even more difficult. And then obviously everyone's interpretation gets added to that along the way. So I think that's probably an unhelpful aspect that could be resolved. We are seeing some progress, enough on the negatives. We've got refreshed guidance from Scottish Forestry, which does address some of the guidance for communities, but it's quite hard to find, and it's kind of buried in a longer document, which probably means it's not as accessible as it could be. Confer training practitioners with stakeholder engagement, which is really promising, and there's a mediation process for best practice guidance between Confer and Communities for Diverse Forestry, and that should be published by the end of the summer, I hope. So just to wrap up, some quick next steps, ideas of how we could build on the good work that is happening. We need to make community engagement mandatory, however that needs to happen, whether it's levers, carrots, rewards, sticks, make it very high scoring on forest grant scheme applications and any other funding mechanisms that come into play. We need training and resources for communities, including local development officers. Community benefit and impact assessments would be helpful. We need participatory monitoring and evaluation of engagement, better engagement, and most of all, probably a gap analysis to say, well, first of all, articulate what we want to achieve, get the specific goals and benchmarks there, and then identify who the responsible parties are and who needs to play a role if they're not already playing a role, and then identifying financial and regulatory gaps as well. At the end of the day, communities do need a seat at the table in all of this, but equally, and that's right up to designing frameworks and strategies right through to delivery, but we also cannot leave it up to volunteers to be flagging up issues and driving change. And that's me. Thank you very much for listening.